We'll make a start then. Welcome to the last session of the day. This panel is just lovely. Actually, we're going to end this seminar series where we began, which was with Frank at the beginning of our series last January. Started us off with an account about what's new about contemporary parenting culture. We're going to end with Frank giving maybe half an hour. So lecture for about half an hour, reflecting on parenting culture, but also in the light of the latest book that he's put out, Wasted, which is about the education system. And he's going to set out his views on the way the culture that we now live in regarding parenting intersects with the development of the education system, and reflect on the problems in both of those arenas, which I think nicely should take us a step forward in our discussions. I'm really glad Frank's here to do this, because I think if there's any individual who is kind of inspired, certainly me, and I know other people in this room, to attempt to develop the study of parenting culture as an important enterprise. It's Frank. His book Parallel Parenting, I think, was really influential for lots and lots of us in getting us to think again about parenting culture, and that book in the context of lots of his other books about risk culture. There's really, I think, been very important scholarship, so I'm delighted that Frank's here to do this. Frank's going to give his lecture, and then we've got two respondents. Anthony Horowitz. I'm kind of amazed putting together this programme that we ended up with this incredibly famous and important author on our programme, which is obviously kind of unusual for academic events, so I'm absolutely delighted that Anthony wanted to do this. Anybody who has a son in the age range, probably 8 to 14, will be very familiar with Anthony because of the importance of his novels for children of that age. And Anthony, together with other writers, has made some very important public comments, particularly around the vetting and borrowing scheme, and wider points about the relationships between adults and children. So I'm really delighted to have Anthony here with us today. Another person who's helping us end where we begun is Jen Howze. This isn't Jenny Russell. Jenny Russell sent her apologies. She emailed me at the end of last week to say that she had to go into hospital for some surgery, which she hadn't envisaged at this point in time, so she sent her apologies for not being able to be here. I emailed Jen and said, could I ask you a really huge favour, and could you step into the breach as a more than adequate replacement? For people who don't know, I'm sure everybody does, but Jen is a journalist at the Times, but is the main person who works on the Alphamummy blog, which for many of us is a lovely read, and has worked very closely in our discussions through this whole series. So I'm delighted that Jen can be here as well. So Frank's going to talk, and then there's going to be comments from Anthony and Jen, and then we're going to open up the discussions with the floor.
Thanks very much, Ellie. A couple of weeks ago, I was asked to come to one of these informal discussions that London-based think tanks organize. And I'm usually asked to come to them because they want somebody that is so different than they are, that they can test their ideas, how it stands up against, kind of I guess someone like myself who's viewed this as being fairly eccentric and safety marginal. And this discussion was more interesting than most, because within 10 minutes I said to myself, either I'm on acid or they're on acid. It wasn't, it was one of those discussions where you felt either you were out of your mind, or they were out of their mind, because basically what it was a discussion. They were trying to figure out, how much bonus good parenting represents in terms of extra years for a child. So the question they were asking, well, if you have really good parenting and good parenting schemes, does that make a 5-year-old, they can only be a 6-year-old child when they go to school? And I said, no, you're wrong about it. It's far more robust than that. Evidence shows that you can literally add 18 months onto a child's literacy and everything else through good parenting. And they were going on very seriously about the parenting impact that could make all the difference to the different outcomes that the child had. And in a sense, I felt really uncomfortable in this discussion, because while they were talking, I remember that about 9 years ago, when I first started working on paranoid parenting and thinking about it before the book came out, I could rely on the fact that in the domain of policymaking and amongst public figures, there were still a critical mass of individuals who basically understood that parenting classes did not really work very, very well. That all the research showed that they were completely ineffective. That could understand that by and large, parenting is not really a suitable subject for policy making. It's something that you'd rather, leave to mothers and fathers to get on with. Sorry about that. I'm getting very excited, what is going through this stuff. That's not me anymore. and that by and large, outcomes for children in terms of what happens are much more influenced by the kind of communities they live in, the kind of cultural influences that they're under, the social position that they experience, and all the rest of that. But that seems to have gone, quite a bit. And one of the things that I find particularly sad is that in this pre-election campaign, all the political parties have bought into the idea that parenting is the big idea, that the way you're going to improve the British way of life is by intervening in the lives of children almost immediately that you are born, and trying to somehow target them, particularly target the potential troublemakers, as a way of reducing state expenditure. And there seems to be this kind of assumption that if you can get the parenting sorted out, then crime problems will wither away. We're not going to have drug abuse anymore, that all the antisocial behavior that we experience is just going to evaporate. And there is a level of naivety amongst policymakers that is truly breathtaking. I mean, you almost have to invent it and create it. But nevertheless, these sentiments are firmly entrenched within political life in this society. And it almost gets to the point where parenting has acquired the status of a standalone causal factor that literally determines everything to do with children. And as I argued in an article yesterday and to them, it's a kind of determinism, parental determinism, has actually succeeded in making the economic determinism of Stalinism seem almost subtle. I mean, compared to all forms of determinism, this is actually far more rigid and mechanical, and leaves almost nothing to chance in terms of the way, in a very unmediated sense, this has been put forward. And it seems to me that as a result of that, we have a number of very big problems on our hand. I'm going to talk about the problem that this represents in relation to education, because I know that you could discuss this in relation to wider parenting issues. But before I go into education, I just want to make one point, which is that one of the consequences on the focus on the parent is to make intergenerational relationships very, very difficult. See, one of the sad things about British society is that we've lost the capacity for there to be a generational conversation occurring, where generations interact with other generations, for the very simple reason that we're only concerned about individual parents, and we're continually constructing parents in a very atomized, individuated way. They're targeted as either good parents or bad parents, and the capacity for adult society to work together as a group of responsible grown-up individuals is becoming more and more something that we don't take particularly seriously. I mean, I think if for no other reason, one of the reasons why intergenerational relations have become quite complicated is because parents have become so obsessed and focused with their own concerns that they no longer regard other adults as their potential allies, but are far more likely to see adults as their enemies. And I think that's one of the sad things that occurs when parenting is kind of posed in this particular way. It creates parental identity in a very individuated way. And it means that you're not simply scared of strangers, you're actually scared of other parents that exist within your schooling. So it's got a very corrosive impact on adult solidarity, but particularly it's got a corrosive impact on education, which is something I've been writing about recently. And I just want to look at that sort of in particular. I think the first problem that we have once parenting is posed in this way is that the moralization of parenting turns mothers and fathers into an educational resource. I mean, quite often when you look at policy documents on education, parents are talked about as kind of adjuncts of children, and parental performance and children's performance becomes entirely interchangeable. The two become very, very closely linked to one another. And therefore, parental input and parental contribution to a child's education is increasingly seen as not just a useful fallback to the child's performance or useful backup, but is increasingly seen as being decisive. It is a decisive causal link of what occurs. And therefore what happens is that parenting practices become increasingly recast and re-represented from a pedagogic perspective. So for example, you no longer just talk to your kids, but in talking to those kids, what you're doing is you're doing a very important job, because that's how children learn responsible communication. And you might have seen a number of research studies that have been published recently that demonstrate that children that go to school with communication problems, who find it very difficult to articulate words and kind of speaking in whole sentences, have this problem because their parents do not talk to them enough. Or often the parents talk to them in the wrong kind of a way. In other words, they work in class. So basically, talking to your kids becomes not just something you do ipso facto as a parent, it becomes an educational resource. Reading at home is now turned into a holy crusade, where there are, again, all these reports that are published that if you do not read to your child, your child loses the equivalent of 9 months, sort of in literacy skills. And some people think it's even more than that. And the idea that you wouldn't read to your child is represented as pure, evil, irresponsible parenting. And the joy of reading, which may spontaneously occur within a family context, where you kind of casually pick up a book and just basically look at this, hey, look at that, have you seen that? Or pick up a newspaper and say, hey, Johnny, look at this particular story about Beckham or something. That's no good, because that's too casual and that's too spontaneous. Reading is turned into a kind of a chore that you have to endure as part of your responsibility as a literary skills teacher. So you do all these things, and you do all these things even before they arrive at school. By the time they arrive at school, if you hadn't done the job properly, you would have failed the child. You really have got to deliver even before they arrive at school. And at which point, when you arrive at school, homework becomes a shared responsibility. Now, you might joke, and sometimes people accuse me of exaggerating, and I never do that. But it was really brought home to me, but 2 months ago I was interviewing a group of parents, and I was talking about homework. And before I could even finish my sentence, this woman, her name was Geraldine, said something. Says, oh yes, Peter and I, that's her really brilliant geography project for us. So Peter is very good at geography. And our son, sort of Tommy, came first in the class. And all the other parents look at them jealous. At first I thought they were taking the piss. I thought they knew where I was coming from and they were trying to egg me on. But actually, Geraldine was 100% kind of into the idea that they are running the geography project. So, and I said, well, don't you think there's something funny about it? How do the teachers react? Well, she says, well, the teachers actually know. The teachers are aware of the fact that Tommy, who's functionally illiterate, probably, isn't going to write this geography project for them. And the point they make is that the teachers take that into account and they sometimes discount marks by 5% or whatever. But basically, what they were describing was a transaction that was taking place between these parents and the teacher through the medium of the children. And what I find quite interesting was the boldness and the kind of the front with which they were almost kind of flaunting into my face as to how good they were at doing this kind of homework. Now, not all parents are so confident as to project that kind of image and they don't boast about it, but a lot of parents are involved in the preparation of their kids' work. And I know that in my days when I was a child, sort of parents who helped their kids with homework would have been called cheaters. That was called cheating. Homework was something you did yourself, not something that was a joint enterprise with a posse of adults and all the rest of that. So basically, you have a situation where homework becomes a shared responsibility. But what you also have in this governmental and policy-making attempt to harness parental anxieties is also a more insidious project, which is what the government is doing and what a lot of, what the Tories are also arguing, because there's a complete bipartisan approach in relation to this, is you rely on parental anxieties as a way of putting pressure on schools. That's the whole argument. So it's basically turning parents into these mini Ofsted individuals with handbags, sort of who kind of come in there and clear up the mess, point out all the bad things that the teachers are doing. Because Ofsted only comes there, once a year, once every 2 years. Far better to have a bunch of pushy parents who hang out at the school gate, kind of gossip and then put pressure upon the teachers. Now, sadly, this is already happening. And I think it's got the most devastating consequences of adult authority. It gets to the point where parents are not only, because what does it mean to put pressure on the teacher? I'll tell you what it means. It doesn't mean that the parents go away and brush up on pedagogic theory, and they kind of, sort of look at, various kind of pedagogues and study John Dewey, and they say, well, that's an interesting idea, and all the rest of that. What it really means is they go to school and they say, why did Johnny, not do better on the exam? Why did little Mary not get on the netball team? Basically what they're doing is special pleading, they're acting as the child's advocate, and demanding favors for their child. And that's happening big time in schools already. And it isn't just simply a small number of middle-class pushy parents from Islington that are complicit in this. It's spread out much wider than that. And it isn't just simply, sort of one sector of the schools, private schools as much as public schools, and everybody is really added. And the consequences are actually quite horrific, right? Quite horrific in two ways. The first thing that occurs is that children do not overlook what's going on. Most children are very intelligent human beings. They're not indifferent or blind to the fact that their mother or father treats the teachers as if they're just these inferior moral beings, right? And they're not blind to the fact of the language they use, right? The kind of contempt which they talk about individual teachers, and even in this group that I was talking to, within a few minutes they were talking about a math teacher as a waste of space, somebody else as useless, sort of various kind of choice euphemisms, which kids really kind of pick up on. So basically what you now have is a situation where, because of this atomized dynamic, where parents act as advocates of their kids and target teachers, not only they communicate this idea of disrespect for the children, but they almost encourage their own children to adopt a very similar approach, where the kids themselves assimilate, internalize the kind of values that their parents have in their dealings with the teacher. And the consequence of that, of course, is a phenomenally important erosion of teachers' authority. And I do think that that's something that's being overlooked. All these politicians that are so busy in terms of advocating pushy parents and parental power overlook the fact that what they are really advocating is the systematic degradation and destruction of teachers' authority. Because what they're doing is they're destroying that insulation that used to exist between school and the rest of the community. That somehow we expected the teachers to be responsible and do the right things within the classroom. And we actually didn't hold them into account over every single decision. You know, we now live in a world where if a teacher disciplines your child, you know, most of the time parents will question the authority of the teacher to do that. I remember when I was disciplined, and it was on more than one occasion when I was a child, the idea that somehow my mother would question my teacher about it and raise philosophical discussions about Frank's self-esteem or all the rest of it would have been unthinkable. Whereas now, it's routine for these kind of decisions, detentions and all the rest of that, to be questioned by teachers, by parents as a result of that. So basically, it seems to me that what happens is that in this attempt to use parents to compensate for the failures of education, we're actually creating a far bigger problem in education than used to be the case in the past. What it does is it atomizes education. I think it's interesting that in public debates, we often take objections to streaming, that's criticized. We criticize the curriculum and testing children. We criticize parents who send their kids to private schools and all the rest of that. And various other criticisms are made about the socially divisive sort of processes at work. But what we don't criticize, we just accept, is a process that is far more socially divisive and far more atomizing, which is the way that we're using parents as consumers of education as a way of disorienting the whole system of education. We overlook the fact that when you have a situation where the parental involvement becomes so decisive, actually, it does lead to unfairness in a way that would have been unthinkable in the past. Far more unfair when so much depends on parental input. When the kind of homework your parent does with you, the amount of time your parent spends with you, you know, sort of becomes decisive. In other words, what happens at home becomes so important. In fact, potentially even more important than what happens in school. Then, of course, what happens is a far more unfair regime is imposed upon education than anything that people used to worry about in the last 40 or 50 years. Because what it does is it turns education into something that it really isn't, into a zero-sum game. You see, I've always argued against conventional educational debates that what both left and right often overlook is that education, unlike any other dimension of human experience, is not a zero-sum game. In other words, if I'm really well educated, that doesn't mean to say that if you take away my ideas, you're going to be better off. Nor does it mean that my education is at your expense. In other words, education is not a resource, not like money is, where if I get more, you get less. There's no direct causal relationship that does that. It's something that in principle could bind us together. It's one of the few things in society that can bind people together from very different backgrounds if we had the right kind of attitude. But if you atomize the parental involvement in education, in other words, you individualize what goes on in the classroom in a way that's quite unprecedented, then you do turn education into a zero-sum game. Because that's how it's experienced. It basically means that if I intervene and get my son into the rugby team, even though he's overweight and can barely walk anymore, right? But because I'm pushy enough, he's in the rugby team, and I've seen comparable situations like that, then somebody else isn't going to be in the rugby team, right? And if I intervene and basically insist that my son or my daughter, you know, comes first in the class or gets the stars or whatever, then that's going to be at the expense of somebody else. So, in a sense, what we've done is that something completely perverse is we're gradually turning education into a zero-sum game in a way that even at the height of the most polarized, elitist moment within British education, it didn't really exist. And of course, behind all this is an army of private tutors. You know, when people talk about private education, don't talk about the fact that in all systems of education, one of the growth areas are these private tutors. Down where I live in Kent, in my town in Faversham, everybody I know in the state school has got 3 or 4 tutors that they're employing. They got, middle class people spend money on cleaning ladies. You know, sort of they spend money on tutors. I mean, that seems to be like the norm, that you got to get these tutors in order to make sure that the child does well. So what we've done is we created education into a zero-sum game, and basically we created a very big problem. Now, you would think that policymakers that are so into parents actually love parents. You know, they really like the parent. When you listen to them talking in private, actually they loathe parents. I mean, they really think that parents are scum of the earth. You know, in fact, they are so loathing of parents that they don't trust parents to teach their children values. They think that I, or any other parent, are a little bit too thick to talk to your kids about sex. You know, there's this myth that parents are too shy to talk to their children about sex, so we need sex education. I don't know about how many the parents you hang out with, but all the parents that I know are quite relaxed. Got no problems about talking to their kids about sex. They might have problems talking to them about death or some other issues, but not about sex. But anyways, sex education is then going to be taught by a teacher in school, who's probably no better, no worse than anybody in this room in discussing those dimensions of life. Schools now talk about citizenship. Schools are taught to talk to kids about happiness and various kind of emotional issues. Every time there's a problem in society, a politician says, oh yes, you know, there is Islamophobia. We need to talk about Islamophobia in schools. Let's put on the curriculum. Oh yes, there's a problem about this. Let's put on the curriculum. So basically what's happened is that schools are charged with the task of teaching kids values. The kind of values that you would normally expect communities and families to transmit to their kids. And therefore what you've got is a very bizarre situation where teachers are doing something they're really not very good at. Right? I mean, I've got a lot of respect for my son's maths teacher. You know, he's a good, he can count, knows the times table, all the rest of that. But I really don't think he's the guy that's going to clinch with him on talking to him about penetrative sex. I don't think he's the best person to do the business, you know, sort of. And my son fully agrees, you know, with that analysis, you know, sort of. In fact, he says, I just watch Skins and I learn far more from that. And most of the teachers that we know aren't particularly good at teaching citizenship, you know, sort of, or any other of these values-related kind of things, because that's not, you know, that's not really a suitable subject for them. It's not as if they kind of learned all these things, you know. Emotional literacy, I mean, just look at most teachers, you know, are they emotionally so, you know, kind of together that they're going to be able to, you know, sort of kind of provide these kind of ideas in a brilliant way. So basically we have a situation where the schools are wasting their precious time, you know, sort of, they're not doing the business with reading and mathematics and everything else. Instead they're teaching the values. And parents, who ought to be doing that, you know, are having to do homework and doing math and geography and biology and everything else. Again, that's not something that they're very good at, because parents, I will tell you, are the worst teachers of their own children. Parents are too closely emotionally linked with their kids to be objective enough to be the right kind of teacher. So you end up with this worst division of the world. We have the worst of both worlds. Parents doing what teachers should be doing, and teachers doing what, you know, sort of parents should be doing. And that's because, in a sense, our politicians neither trust our teachers, nor do they touch parents. I think that if you look at the level of contempt that is being expressed to both of those groups, the way in which bad teachers have become this new discovery in political debates, that we've got to get rid of all these bad teachers. I'm not saying that they're all Einstein by any means, but nevertheless, you know, it is a bit galling, this new discovery, and all these parental deficits. You do realize there's a very, very big problem here. So the point I'm really trying to get at is that one of the consequences of this parenting culture that we've been discussing is that it undermines authority in schooling, precisely in the place where authority is the foundation for education. I mean, it doesn't matter what your educational principle is, whether you're a progressive in education, or you're conservative or whatever, but at the end of the day, you do need to have education being underpinned by some sense of authority, either the authority of the subject, the discipline that you're doing, or the authority of the teacher, or whatever. It doesn't really matter, or just pure cultural authority. You do need to have something like that in order for the kids to learn something. And it seems to me that what we've done is we've undermined that in a wholesale kind of a way, and introduced a form of regime in education that actually divides the adult world against one another, encourages a kind of silent civil war, where we're too scared to work together, where we don't let other adults anywhere near our children, in case they harm them, or simply because we just don't trust them. And the consequences of that for education, I think, is really bad. And what I want to conclude on is that instead of focusing on the conventional sort of topics in the educational debate, on testing, the curriculum, on screening and all the rest of that, I think it's far more important to focus on the horrible division of labor that's been established between parents and schools. I think that's really the area that we need to address in order to make a bit of a difference and help our kids out to have a better education. Thank you.
Gosh, it's interesting to find myself agreeing and disagreeing with Frank, but that's at the same time, that's so much what he says. I know we'll forgive the response of somebody who has no qualifications at all to be here, other than being a children's author. And so if I may, I was thinking about some of the comments you made, Frank, and just give you a response to them, starting with your slightly sort of cynical view of reading as a holy crusade. I don't mean cynical, but just sort of disparaging. Since I spent most of my life crusading for just that, I think that we underestimate the importance of parents reading with children. I think it's a very dangerous thing to do, because actually I believe that nobody in the discussion of reading is actually drawing the line between reading and storytelling. And sitting down with your children in the evening, whether it's for 5, 10, 15 minutes, however much time you can spend, and storytelling with them, is, I think, one of the most crucial things to the development and the growing up and the education of a child. And that's very different instead from really, understanding paragraphs and punctuation and all the rest of it. I forget who it was it Bruno Bettelheim, the famous child psychologist, who drew our attention to the fact that fairy tales, the most basic storytelling for children, are all life lessons, and the whole thing about going into the woods, understanding darkness, death, separation at a very young age, are very important, because you can work out all your phobias as a young person through simply the mechanism of having a story told to you at night. Storytelling connects us, it tells us who we are, how we got here, and I think to remove that or to disparage it in any way is very wrong. And I also think, incidentally, that children who read, although we may not like to think of this, are better advantaged than children who don't. I can never get away from a question I was asked after the death of Sarah Lancaster, who was the girl who was murdered in the famous Goth murder. If the boys who had murdered her had read books when they were growing up, would they have committed the murder? The simplistic answer is, of course they wouldn't have. I know that there are lots of other reasons why not, because a house that has books in it is different to a house that doesn't, and there are all sorts of other values going on there. But I think nonetheless that the whole argument about reading is one that should not be underestimated in this area at all. You talked also about the erosion of teachers' authority and the authority of parents. And this, to me, is also something I don't really understand. In the discussions I've been in today, I've got the feeling that children are from Mars and adults are from Venus, almost. That we're talking about these two very, very different breeds of people, when actually we're all exactly the same. And what's going on actually is that it's adults who are being infantilized, and that, I think, is the core of the problem that we're seeing in all the things you're discussing about education. That where does this erosion of teachers' authority come from, if not from, and this is where I came to agree with you at the end of your conversation, from the politicians who don't trust the teachers, who don't trust the parents, who don't trust anyone. And as a parent myself, I think the most important thing is to rely on my own judgment, and to rely on my own good sense, and not to be bullied and pushed around by people trying to tell me what to do. You say that perhaps parents shouldn't intervene at schools. I wish to heaven that my parents had intervened a little bit more when I was at school, being beaten about every 3 weeks by a vicious old crone called Mr. Ellis, my headmaster at my school, who would beat anybody for any reason, who would beat children until the blood ran down the back of their legs, And this was considered normal and proper behaviour back in the 60s. And I just wish to heaven that my parents had actually questioned what was going on a bit more and got involved a bit more. And although I am perfectly aware and agree with you about the sort of pushy parent who said, you said, I think, who wants the child on the hockey team even though the child is fat, those pushy parents are part of life's rich tapestry. We need them, and we know that their children are going to end up as miserable and as unhappy and as unsuccessful as the parents themselves. And we quite enjoy watching their downfall. So I didn't agree on that point either. As to why things like gay, sex, drugs and citizenship are taught in schools, well, it goes back to the same reason, because that's because schools no longer have time to get down to the important things, such as, for example, reading books. And again, I don't think one can demark books as being belonging to home and not to school, and school having other things. I learned about citizenship. What a ghastly word that is, citizenship. What on earth does it mean anyway? Citizenship I learned from reading Biggles. When I was about 8 years old. And I know, of course, nowadays the view of Biggles as sort of, you know, this patriotic chap or whatever would seem a little bit old-fashioned, whatever. I think one underestimates how much children can make decisions for themselves based on the stories they read. Stories connect us, as I began by saying. I'm going round in circles because I had prepared something to talk, but I'm just responding to you. This morning, I was going to finish by saying that this morning, I was, or just before this session, I was listening to Stuart Waiton and his session. He was talking about the collapse of authority. And I think this is really where the argument should be based. What is causing the collapse of authority in schools and parents? And my view is, and the reason why I'm here today, and the reason I got involved in this whole argument, which began, as you said, with the criminal vetting system, is because of an overburden by the government and by politicians in what is our business as parents and as teachers. And the collapse of authority can be seen in all sorts of different ways. I was surprised that this morning, Stuart, actually back there, you didn't talk more about legislation that makes it almost impossible for communities, for ordinary people like me, to even put my hand around a child without having my motives questioned. For teachers, I'm not talking about that old-fashioned clip on the ear, which I think we've moved away from, and which is probably a good thing to have left behind. But for example, I have my photograph taken probably with about 5,000 or 10,000 children a year. And whenever they take their photograph of me, the one thing they always want to do is to give me this enormous hug. They put their arm around my neck and they pull me close to them and our faces are touching. And I'm often thinking, while this is happening, and the mum or the dad is standing there desperately trying to get the mobile telephone to work, which they never can do exactly, I'm thinking to myself, actually I'm breaking the law here. But what I'm doing can be so easily misconstrued, even though I'm in a room with lots and lots of people. And this whole intervention by government, the number of laws that we've had aimed at trying to separate children from teachers and children from parents, I think that is the core of the problem. Added to which, and then I will stop, is I think that what's happened at the same time, and this is largely due to 12 years of an extremely intrusive and undermining government, is that our authority as adults has been taken away from us one step at a time until we ourselves are being treated like children. Everybody in this room has so many rules thrown at them to tell us how to behave. It's as if the whole moral base, the religious, the moral, the philosophical base of our life has gone away, and all these sticking plasters are being put there instead. So we are told from the moment we wake up to when we go to bed, how to behave. I'll give you an example of it. Coming here to this conference on the bus today, I saw 9 different instructions on how to behave on that bus. And what made me even more angry and wanted me to tear the thing off the wall was an advert on the watch. It was on the tube. It was on the tube coming before the bus, on the tube to King's Cross Station. I won't eat smelly food, it said, and I'll keep my feet off the seats. And there were 2 little gonk-like figures telling me, 55 years old, how to behave. I won't eat smelly food. I mean, if we as adults are treated like children, then how on earth can we find the authority to get children to behave like adults?
Well, first of all, just to respond to that, where we're told how to behave, I think one of the reasons why, or one of the things we see on Alphamummy and on the School Gate, the Times' other blog, is that adults and parents have a real sense of helplessness. That's why I think so many grab onto this idea of parent power, being a pushy parent, because you don't feel like the system's going to look out for you, look out for your kid. You don't even know if you'll get a place at school, which is, I mean, pretty astonishing that, you know, you could live in a normal area in a normal city in England and still be like, oh, actually my kid's not going to go to school because I didn't get on a list or we live too far away, et cetera, et cetera. And people feel like they can't be laissez-faire about it because they're really gambling with their child's future because, of course, while we may be skeptical about the idea that first they have to get a certain number of A grades and then they have to go to this university and they have to know these computer skills and this and this and that, while we may be skeptical, it's hard to just say, actually, we're going to take a flyer and see if they don't really need it. I don't think they do. We'll find out in 20 years. So, but on the idea of authority, really parents, what people tell us on our blogs and basically in the blogosphere, they agree. They want teachers and other adults to have more authority. The problem is that we can't really agree what that authority really means. For example, I posted about this idea of authority, and there was some interesting, and it was touching on areas such as giving kids the authority to run their own lives as well. Do we have the authority to let go and let them experience life? And somebody wrote, can these parents that are frightened of their children getting a scraped knee in the playground not remember what their own childhoods are like? Do they not remember falling down and living to tell the tale? And then somebody else writes, if most attacks on children, this is on the same thread, so we're getting a sense of the diversity of opinion. If most attacks on children, most murders of children are committed by their parents or other family members, why isn't there a law mandating CRB checks on prospective and repeat parents? Just because it's politically difficult doesn't mean it shouldn't be done. Hopefully it's just a question of time. I just think that highlights, and I have another couple posts here that I'd just like to refer to. These came from Free Range Kids, which is the blog of a woman whose 9-year-old went on the tube or the bus on his own in New York. And one woman wrote about her 8-year-old. She allowed her to ride her bike all over town. I would have preferred she go with friends, but the other parents were too busy questioning my sanity. I think it's quite interesting that even though she's saying, oh, I'm about my authority, I'm about my kid's authority, but the other parents who question what I'm doing don't really, I don't think they have any authority to do it their way. And she goes on to say, my daughter would go to the bookshop and read magazines, go to the art gallery and talk to the artists, go to the park, walk around the toy store to daydream, and even go to City Hall and chat with the mayor. Then she goes on to say, what other parents didn't understand is that my child is much safer than theirs. If anything is off-kilter or odd concerning my daughter, at least a dozen people will notice. The sequestered child is unknown in the community. How will the nice lady at the drugstore know when those people with her are not her parents? So that's kind of a nice idea of something that we see a lot, people longing for that adult authority. As a community, we as adults feel comfortable exerting authority over our own children, over other people's children. She mentions, if my daughter makes a left turn on her bike without signaling, I'll know it. And I feel comfortable that those people in my community are letting me know, and also my daughter knows that they're adults to respect. And then you have somebody else saying, my daughter started coming home from school complaining she was told her apples should have been without the skin and the oranges were dangerous. I contacted the school. They told me even though there's no formal list, they do not encourage skin on fruit because it could be a choking hazard. A few mothers and I ignored them and continued to send normal fruit. And the lunch mothers, who are PTA members, so mothers who are volunteering, make the kids feel bad by constantly telling them it's not allowed. The no-processed lunch meat is another story altogether. A few of the PTA mothers decided it was unhealthy and again constantly harassed the kids during lunch by saying so. And the school and the principal go along with this because the PTA does raise a lot of money for the school. So, it's quite interesting there. It's the idea of community, authority. I want other parents or other people to step in and be able to say comfortably, stop doing that to my kid. Except when I disagree with them, in which case they're being really uptight and they need to mind their own business. So I think one of the problems we have with authority these days is that because there's such diversity, and maybe because of the internet, we're so much more aware of the diversity and the number of opinions out there, that there's no real one answer in terms of what that authority is.
Okay. Frank, do you want to come back? Start with
Yeah, just on that final point that Jenny makes, which I really recognize. When I was doing some interviews for Wasted, the pattern was always the same. The parents would want the teachers to discipline their children. And they said, I really believe in the authority of the teacher. And the teacher said, I really hope these parents discipline the kids, you know, and they really believe in parental authority. But in both cases, this was an entirely rhetorical gesture. And it wasn't because of diversity of experience, because what they really meant was that they wanted the teacher to use authority against all the kids other than their own. Right? And that's what they were happy with. As long as their child wasn't disciplined, that was all right. So they had this kind of double standard in terms of discipline matters. And as far as more general adult authority was concerned, which they paid lip service to, they bought into the idea that you cannot trust other adults. And I think that's one of the problems that we have. One of the reasons why CRB and the new method isn't really checked is because at the end of the day, there's a phenomenal amount of passive support for it. You have to remember that if you're on the British left, you will criticize the anti-terrorism laws for encroaching upon our civil liberties. And there's a noble tradition of liberalism that criticizes all these illiberal laws, even though these are temporary laws. Now, they might not be temporary, but at least from the statute book, they're temporary. But when you have the same illiberal laws in the CRB form, that's cool, that's legitimate. And you don't have, sort of Amnesty International or Liberty or any of the other organizations organizing campaigns against the CRB, because it involves children. Right? And the minute you bring in children, then a different standard of attitude kind of prevails. And we have to recognize that even people who outwardly say they're against the CRB checks, actually when push comes to shove, passively support it. There's very few people that are prepared to stand up like the way you were doing, Anthony, and really kind of speak against that. And I think that tells us that what they're really saying is they do not trust adult authority. In other words, because they don't trust adults to come anywhere near their kids. That's the way that it works. And for example, I've been involved in children's sports, and I watch children playing sports Sunday after Sunday after Sunday, and no parent that I've seen, I've not yet seen a single parent say, I'll take a picture of those kids, because I want to see a proper family photo album. I want my kids' picture to be there. And you think that statistically there will be at least one parent that would break the mold and take a picture, and they all murmur about it. They all say, this is really stupid, I can't take a picture of the kids playing on the field, but nobody does that. Right? And I think that indicates to us just how feeble the idea of adult authority has become. On Anthony's point, which I think I completely agree with what you're saying, except maybe it's a slightly different way of understanding it. You see, you're very angry about the idea of being told how to behave, as I am. I mean, I find that really insulting when you have these infantile, sort of notices telling you to do the obvious. And I think that's one of the most destructive dynamics that's been set in place, where it almost has an Orwellian character to it, where there's all these subliminal messages that tell us how to behave. From my point of view, the sociologist, telling us how to behave is understood as rendering what until now has been informal, often taken for granted, into formal. So to get to the idea of reading, you see, it's one thing for you and I, or for anybody else, to pick up a book and to read to your kids, or to talk about a fairy tale, which is a really important part of a family experience. But that happens, historically has happened spontaneously, in a way that is part of our relationships with each other. And we decide that telling stories constitutes an important dimension of our identity as a family. And the stories that we tell is who we are as a family. So it becomes quite important in that. It's another thing when you're told that you have to read to your child. We're telling you how to behave. And that's really what I'm objecting to, is when reading becomes like, sort of those, giving your child the fruit